Let's talk about active and passive voice. Now, if you're anything like me, when I was in high school and I had teachers mark this on my paper, I had no clue what they were talking about. And even better, I had no clue how to fix it. So let's talk about what it actually is before we take a look at how we can work it in and correct it. So we've got active and passive voice. When you speak in the active voice, what's happening is the subject is performing the action in your sentences, right? He kicked the ball. He is our subject, and he's performing the action, right? He's kicking the ball. Passive voice, though, is when the action is performed on the object rather than having the subject perform it. So look at this sentence in passive voice. The ball was kicked by him. So now this object that we had up here has become the focus, and it's being performed, all right? So it's not as clear what's going on or where the focus is. Now, passive voice is not always the criminal. You can use it sometimes, but let's take a look at why you might want to use active voice. Active voice is really non-scientific. It adds a lot of emotion to your writing. It's definitely much more clear, and it helps you avoid wordiness. Look at the length of this sentence compared to the length of this sentence. You definitely saved yourself some words. So if you're somebody that's working under a word constraint and you're afraid you're going to go over, flipping to active voice is really going to be helpful for you. Now, like I said, passive voice isn't always bad. When it's used sparingly, it can create an objective style because it takes the focus off the subject. So it's you can use it for that, and then it's okay when the performer is either unknown or unimportant. And we'll take a look at an example of that. But one thing to keep in mind is if you're consistently writing in passive voice, your writing is going to be cloudy, it's going to be wordy, and it's not going to be easy to understand. So let's take a look at some ways that you can help identify when you're writing in active voice and when you're writing in passive voice. So the first trick is if your sentence includes a prepositional phrase with the word by, you probably have active voice, you probably have passive voice. Think about that first example. The ball was kicked by him. So there's that example of how that's pulled in. Passive voice verbs also will always contain a to be verb. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. It doesn't mean that every time you use a to be verb, you're talking in passive voice, but it is one indicator that you might be there. So anytime you see is, am, are, was, were, or been, double check to see which voice you're speaking in. Let's take a look at some examples. All right, the police were notified that there was a felon on the loose. All right, so we see this were, and that's our first clue that we actually are in passive voice, right? The police aren't actually performing any action there. We know that they were being notified, and they probably were being notified by somebody. So we've got passive voice, but this is an example of when it's okay. Really, if we added the police were notified by the dispatcher, that doesn't add much to our sentence. The identity of the dispatcher doesn't really seem to be important. So this would be an example of when that the performer is unknown or unimportant. So you can kind of keep it there. All right. Now we have the students pass the summer reading exam. Is this active voice or passive voice? Well, let's look at our subject, the students. Are they actually performing an action? Yeah, they passed the exam. So they're actually doing something. This is active voice. All right. The information you need will be presented by the teacher tomorrow. All right, we've got a big indicator here that we're in passive voice. Remember we said the prepositional phrase that starts with the word by and is followed by an object is an indication that we might be in passive voice. And here we are, because if we go to the subject, the information, it's not doing anything. There's no action there. All right, if we wanted to take this and transfer it into active voice, it would be pretty easy though. We can decide, well, who's actually doing something here? Well, it's the teacher that's going to be presenting information. So let's focus here and change the sentence to, the teacher will be presenting the information you need tomorrow. Now we've taken the same idea, flipped it from passive to active. Finally, I will sit by the oak tree. All right, we've got that by word again. So let's double check it. It is followed by an object there, but is this object doing anything in the sentence? No. In fact, we have a subject up here, I, and we have I sitting by the tree. So this is actually an example of something that's in active voice that does include that prepositional phrase with the by. So don't always let it lead you down that passive path. So hopefully now you can differentiate between the two, active and passive voice. Like I said, Passive is not always bad, but you want to use it sparingly. And now you've got some tricks for turning it into active voice when you're in passive voice.